about track thinking. Like when your parents or someone said to you, it was assumed to be a mentor, and the mentor was an authority figure, and you listened to that authority figure because they displayed, whether overtly or in a sort of volcanic sort of way, of violence, that there would be repercussions if you did not stay on track. So track thinking is assumed to give you everything. It gives you the reason to go to school, the reason that you have to get good grades. Track thinking is compliance. Track thinking is causes. It's a causal set. It gives you a reason for living. It's so deep and penetrating into culture and society that if you don't stay on track, you're considered what would be thought of as gadabout or wolken at one time, right? A pariah, right? A persona non grata. So this led into and leads into revolutions. You can look into Pierre Proudhon, mutualism, anarchism, true land right ownership, but it really gets into the executive prowess, the executive process of, are you alive? Are you alive for a reason? You break down reason, ratio, degree. Reason isn't just a notional sort of surface understanding of going into a rationalistic mind. It is led by, ironically, the teleology, outcomes first, outcomes thinking, outcomes only, casting away the track. So the irony is that the people that are the best in the discourse of this track thinking, that is, you get on this career track, the people that are celebrated at the highest echelon are oftentimes people who will teach you in the end how they became so great at what most people go through arduous suffering only to become mediocre at a given task, right? They get too involved in the breakdown of tasking. They want to look at a blueprint. They want to see the process, right? And it really is about process thinking. And when you start to see how the teleology and the doxastic aspects of thinking by way of symbols and intuition become invaluable under the guise of greatness, and that the greatness is what we celebrate, you begin to wonder what's going on here, right? You look at the entire subset and you go, only certain people are allowed to shine, and the majority isn't expected. In fact, when you really look at what's going on and you open your eyes up and you have that, fully vivid, jaw-dropping, awestruck moment that could lead to a catharsis where you go into this emotional overload to the point where all your circuits are so overloaded, all you see is the pervading truth. When people do this, and I've discussed this, like metanoia is a term where this transformation is taking place. So many of us are on the forefront of this transformative transmutation, right? Where they don't know who they are anymore. They're going through this existential crisis. There used to be simple aphorisms and terms for this, like a midlife crisis. Well, when you're 20 years old going through this, can you call it a midlife crisis? Or 85, right? So when people are no longer capable of going about their task, when their motor neurons are 100% believing that is the reason, the ratio, the causal set of why they even exist, they go through this fundamental breakdown, this crisis. And many would say that's the dark night of the soul. That's when people truly begin to exist, when they truly begin to exhibit what it means to be. More to the point is what's happening now through, we're going to call it planned obsolescence, because when you get into this causal set track thinking, you may as well be a piece of technology, right? Really more so a piece of hardware, machinery. So as long as you see yourself as a machine and you don't rail against the system, you are considered a non-threat. But when you become persona non grata, when you become the pariah, so to speak, and the first thing that you'll notice, your body wants to walk. It wants to stretch. It wants to move. And if you want to look at this in a very critical way, from a secular sense, from an empirical perspective, you could look deeper into Dr. Michael Levin's work, where he, in his study of anthrobots, xenobots, he's actually looking at these bullfrog embryo, cell structures that are changed from, they're morphologically changed from the physicality, and they forget themselves and don't know what to do and start to exhibit independent behavior, right? So is independence just aberrant? Is life and existence, that is, I'm breathing, I'm being, right? It really gets deep into philosophy at that point. You start looking at Descartes, Heidegger, right? Design, and all these other focused terms that deal with the anthropological mechanism of existence, why? And that we have to come to some sort of existential altar where we have to prove ourselves, or end of life. We are invariably, inevitably coming before this holy council of bearded men, and maybe some really, cold, like I think of Jason Rizzo-Giorgiani on Break the Rules, right? That Lev just put up a little snippet of a 22-minute snippet, and he's talking about this, this seems off topic, but when you're talking about this Nordic race, Hyperboreans, if you will, thought to be those who have interacted with us for quite some time, and they are depicted as these very almost like Nordic, rigid, perfect beings that sort of are also depicted as angels or an angelic sect of people. They follow a certain legacy or rule, a blueprint, if you will, that almost puts them in this demonic state or stage of legion, right? Where they're working as one, they're working together. They don't have any aberrant, off the rail thinking, personal expression. And what we get into again when we reference Jason Rizzo-Giorgiani is this word techne. We're getting deeper into philosophy and philosophical terms, right? And then obviously Burkhard Heim and Bohm. A lot of these people, Jacobo Grinberg, a lot of these people have gone under the investigatory mind of what happens when you break free. Is there life? Do you go into the true monad, or this God, as it's depicted in Coptic Gnostic type texts, where there seems to be this ongoing theme or reference that says all that you're going to do is, from sort of chimera or amalgamated sense, return back into your roots, right? Of the spirit of what you are. Well, what we've recognized is that our spirits and our bodies often don't match. And that what seems to be happening is those that do match are deemed successes, but a success in our culture means that you have no free thought whatsoever. That you're weird if you think about such things like Terrence McKenna might bring up, with machine elves, that a lot of people like to go back to that, or DMT trips, ayahuasca, right? Salvia. I had a very strange salvia experience where I finally had gotten, this was many years ago when they were selling salvia at these head shops under incense, right? And I took the higher amount, and it was a very, very short experience, but it's very impacting. Where I noticed that everything seems to be compartmentalized into these invisible dome structures, where I could actually see the tiles of these unseen structures, and that reality itself really was a holographic image. It was a hologram where you could see the actual tiles and the segments and the sort of quadrants and zones, where you realize, why would this be segmented off? Why would I notice that this compartmentalization is necessary, right? And then I started to really affirm a lot of the things that I thought before, where all we're really doing is living within the confines of a certain spherical anomaly, and that this anomaly, through a kinetic chain process, is merely just being redisplayed with slightly different alchemical attributes. You've got a little bit more of this condition in this particular realm that serves this particular track, right? That gives way to a lot of the other things that Jason Rizzo-Giorgiani has discussed and talked about, that I posted up a mini deep dive into. And it is about data carrying actual mass, and the release of this data, or the attempted erasure of this data, actually unleashes in quantity. When you look at the petabytes and the massive amount of information that's stored, that there's postulations. And yeah, Jason Rizzo-Giorgiani, he has some very, especially when you look at his latest, most recent interview with Jesse Michaels. And then, you can get into Jesse Michaels and what that agenda is, but you go back to Peter Thiel, you look at Elon Musk, and you begin to look at the fact that these people are behaving much like the Nordic race. Like, they're really not allowed to, they grapple with personal expression. You see Elon Musk popping out all these kids acting so quirky and strange. You see this interaction with such Nordic, Nordic peoples, like this Ingrid Cold that Jason Rizzo-Giorgiani talks about in this Mount Pleasant area. If you want to look it up for reference, I think I got that right. But I've read this on Substack, and I've heard him talk about it several times. And then I looked it up, and there's actually several cases that cannot be validated, but there's a causal set there where there were many witnesses, right, that talked about specific interactions. And in Dread Cold, he was, he introduced himself as In Dread Cold. That was later sort of, colloquially re-administered as Ingrid Cold, right? So when you get into this cold disposition, when you look at thermodynamics, when you see, the perfect crystalline structure emerge at or below absolute theoretical zero, and you start to postulate absolute hot, and you look at, these plasma signatures and the interaction with pure light, and the refraction and the reflection back into these perfect crystalline forms and structures. This is the type of thing that's been talked about over and over again, but when you do discuss what we are in the transient sense, that we are one of those gradients, one of those forms of this combustible photon collision shift light information codifying and coming into being, and that what's really taking place is that we are at the threshold again, with a supposed history behind us, that a lot of people are challenging. You hear Cliff High talk about this a lot when we talk about Tartaria, right? Stellium 7, he talks about this quite a bit. Recently, he had a really good interview on his channel as well, that you may want to go check out. It's Jason. He's more of like an esoteric, I can't remember what his channel is, but he's a very successful esoteric writer. Spent a lot of these guys, it's interesting because many of them spent cult rejects. A lot of these people spent a decent stint in prison, right? Sean Atwood, right? Very successful. A lot of these people, they spent an extent of time in prison, many years, and emerged out of prison with a newfound sort of philosophical outlook, because what they turned to was more esoteric traditions, or at least from another non-liminal perspective, trying to get and grasp toward this liminal or arcane state of mind, and begin to grasp, who am I? What am I? What is this? What is this cognition? What is reality? Why feel? Why exist? Why breathe? Why take up air, food? Why pollute the information highway, and thus overburden the data mass just by mere existence? Like this whole idea of being an aimless sort of persona non grata. And many people saying, well, this is when you come into techne, this is when you come into existence, right? So this is the entire thing, to where we, like DNA rescrambling that I talk about, the addition of uracil, adenine, thymine, guanine, cytosine, that we are to be directed in the causal aspect of our own teleology, and that we are intuitively supposed to just know what we exist for, and that existence isn't aberrant, and that there's this idea of generation and creation, and perhaps we are supposed to spontaneously come onto this, where we aren't polluted in the fact of, or told what we are supposed to do with the educations of mind, sin, experience, that a lot of the stuff that Jordan Maxwell talks about, right? The sign, right? Things that lead into a lot of what Michael Tessarian goes into the discourse with. And I think Jason Rizzo-Giorgiani is a perfect counter to that, and then to sort of bring you back into philosophical terms. You have this heavy grounding that could be considered more like Heidegger or Nietzsche, where they're trying to give you foundational terms to understand this, and then you go into this sort of pathos, rhetoric, and sway that Dostoevsky, Herman Melville investigate, this whale of moral denial, or this need to better the mind, the techne, the teleology, being and becoming, being in time, to be able to express yourself in such a way that you are of this higher mind, and you are a practitioner of the higher mind. It starts to get back into the golden dawn. It gets into what the great work might be. It gets into the fact that you have these bookends where Jason Reza Georgiani actually calls himself a Satanist even in this most recent interview. He doesn't try to discount or deny things, but he's saying, look, this isn't a physical aspect of a simple statement. If I'm with these sort of outcast rebels that could be considered amalgamated into the process of what Prometheus represents, right? The adversary, then I am that advocate for adversarial thinking, right? But the fact that he correlates himself, proselytizes and plagiarizes back to people like Amon Hillman and others that are more overt and non-apologetic in their approach with this. You begin to kind of look at Abraxas and other depictions of what hell with one L is, Satana or Satanus. The idea of this credo matwa sort of conceptualization of kind of first when you look at the Hindus and the third sex or the the Eastern Indian cultures, when you begin to look at credo matwa and the famous David Icke interview with his discussions about the reptilians and the hermaphrodite origins and what we were created for. Perhaps we are that lifeline who exists, and without our existence in the information field through these data sets, there really is no life. There is no techne. There is no creation. Perhaps we are to come to and crave information, but just the right amount of information in order to go into and break off into full creativity. In other words, perhaps the space, time, space, density, mass. When we get into the elements and the production of these elements through star birth, when we get into matter, mantra, reason, being, you begin to look at things of the main discourse, the main motivation is quite possibly 100% teleologically based, where our outcome and the outcome of our thought and the expression of our existence, having to survive in the wild, having to survive as a break-off civilization, that only a small percentage of people would get this, and that those people have to be captured, and whatever essence they have that marks them as creators is in fact through the progression and the assistance with this higher ontological mind. When we talk about true ontology, it's beyond the temporal realm, right? But it requires that the hotbed, the hothouse of an earth, of a completely mediated field from gases to the heat that just burgeons life and allows the flourishing of life, but causes enough of it from the causal set perspective need to survive, where it keeps these hormone prompts ever more hungry and in progression toward things, people that have people like Shakespeare and Monet, and you get into so many others that Da Vinci that express this singular God mind creativity, who may or may not have existed as true individuals, but may have been used as a codified learning system to backward engineer and say a person like this existed. Now who are you? In other words, maybe the entire process here is to produce spontaneously an unregistered, unseen, newer life form that could go on and carry this torch further because of an incomplete state of existence. That they are actually searching for that next representative of cathartic metanoia, where the entire reason for this weird prison planet and how many cycles we've been through over and over again, that gets into Randall Carlson studying these cycles and the Younger Dryas and so forth, these drumlin lines and volcanic activity and the ice ages and this propensity to offer up human sacrifices and worship a sort of Dionysian thelemic god through samsara. And really the rest of the people, the only time that they were safe is when they supplicated and capitulated and said, I will not go about free thought, I will stay on this track thinking, and even more so, as long as I do single track thinking, I will take up my stoic cause and be the best proletariat that I can possibly be. That this idea of an overman or an ubermensch, really, if you look at it, this higher man, Jason Reza Georgiani gets into this with Nietzsche's work, particularly Beyond Good and Evil, and really getting into Thus Spoke Zarathustra, where you have this direct difference, a delineation between the ubermensch, as high as the aspirations as the ubermensch can, and these peaks and valleys, and reestablishing new trials, right? New peaks, new horizons, unfathomable, unseen as yet, to go on to that next unmet quadrant, right? And that the ubermensch would carry along the higher man to where the status quo, the general median, would be raised up. So it kind of gets into the idea of this ubiquitous focus on water levels, currency, and the fact that if this is if the registry of this overburdened data set